It started on what should have been a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of day where the sun rises soft and golden over the rooftops, where the smell of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke lingers in the air, and the only noise is the faint rustle of trees and the occasional bark of a dog. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, thinking about the chores I had promised myself I would get to but probably wouldn't, changing the oil in the truck, fixing the squeaky hinge on the gate, maybe finally organizing the tools in the garage that had been piling up like junk in a pawn shop. My wife, Claire, was a different story altogether. She wasn't the type to sit back and let a day slip by without doing something to make it brighter. That morning, she had woken up before me, her energy buzzing like she'd downed 3 espressos before her feet even hit the floor. She had dragged out a ladder, a box full of Christmas lights, and a vision in her head of making our porch sparkle even though it was nowhere near December. She loved lights, the way they glowed against the wood siding of our house, the way they turned ordinary evenings into something magical. She said it reminded her of the festivals she grew up with in her hometown, where every street corner felt alive with color, laughter, and a little mischief. By the time I realized what she was up to, she was already halfway done, climbing up and down that ladder like she'd been training for a firefighter's academy. The lights she picked weren't ordinary white strands either, no, these were neon blues, fiery reds, greens that looked like fresh spring grass, and yellows that warmed the eyes. I leaned against the porch railing, shaking my head at her determination, but truthfully, I admired it. Claire had this stubborn streak that made her impossible to argue with when her mind was set. I told her, you know the HOA's gonna have a fit about this. She glanced down at me, her hair tied back, a smile curving at the edges of her mouth, and said, let them try. This is our house, not theirs. That was the thing about her, where I sometimes hesitated, she charged forward without fear. It was one of the reasons I fell in love with her. The day carried on peacefully until the sound of heavy boots crunching down the sidewalk broke the calm. At first, I thought it was just one of the neighborhood joggers or maybe a delivery guy who didn't know how to walk lightly. But then I saw them, 3 men dressed in uniforms that looked suspiciously official, but not quite right. Their shirts had patches that said HOA Security Enforcement, words I had never in my life seen stitched on anything resembling law enforcement gear. They wore aviator sunglasses even though the sun was half hidden by clouds, and their belts carried handcuffs, flashlights, and what looked like pepper spray. They walked with the kind of swagger that screamed, we want you to believe we're cops, but my gut told me they weren't. I set my coffee down and straightened up, my jaw tightening as they marched straight onto my lawn like they owned it. Claire was still on the ladder, stringing the last section of lights across the porch beam, humming to herself, completely unaware of the storm about to break. The tallest one of the bunch, a bald guy with a thick neck and a smirk plastered on his face, called out, "Ma'am, you need to come down from there immediately. You're in violation of Community Code 7B-14, unapproved decorative displays." Claire froze for a second, then turned her head slowly, squinting at them like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Excuse me," she said, incredulous. "I'm hanging lights on my own porch." The man stepped closer, his boots grinding against my driveway. "Ma'am, this is a direct order from the Homeowners Association. You're required to remove those immediately. If you fail to comply, we'll have to take further action." Something inside me snapped at that moment. Maybe it was the smug way he spoke, like we were children being scolded. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of a group of grown men acting like they had jurisdiction over colored lights on a private home. I walked down the porch steps, closing the distance between us, and said, "You've got to be kidding me. Who the hell do you think you are? Those aren't cops' uniforms. You've got no authority here." The shorter one, a wiry guy with a patchy beard, stepped forward and barked, "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you. Your wife is violating HOA rules." Claire, bless her heart, climbed down the ladder and planted herself right beside me, crossing her arms. "Oh, it does concern him. It's his house too. And unless one of you is carrying a real badge, you're trespassing." That was when things escalated faster than I could have imagined. The bald one suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Claire by the wrist and twisting her arm behind her back. She cried out in pain, stumbling as he forced her toward the lawn. Before I could react, he whipped out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them around her wrists, locking them tight. My blood turned to fire. I shouted, "Hey! Get your damn hands off her," and stepped forward, but the wiry one shoved me back with surprising force. Claire's face was flushed with anger, not fear, as she struggled against the cuffs, yelling, "You can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong." The neighbors began to gather on the sidewalks, whispering, some pulling out their phones to record. That's the thing about this neighborhood, people loved gossip more than justice. They'd rather film a fight than stop it. I tried again to push past them, but the third guy, a heavy-set man with sweat dripping down his forehead, blocked me with his bulk. He growled, "Stay back unless you want to be arrested too." That word, arrested, rang hollow in my ears. Arrested by who? Fake HOA cops? What court would back that up? Still, the sight of my wife being dragged across our lawn like some criminal lit a rage inside me I hadn't felt in years. My fists clenched, and for a split second, I considered swinging at the bald one, breaking his nose, maybe worse. But I knew that would only make things messier with all those cameras rolling. Instead, I shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're impersonating officers. That's a federal crime." The bald man sneered, not even flinching. "We're authorized by the HOA board. That's all the authority we need." Those words burned into my brain. Authorized by the HOA. Since when did a bunch of retirees and busybodies on a board get to deputize their own goon squad? Claire, despite the pain in her wrists, raised her chin defiantly. "You're going to regret this," she spat at him. And she meant it. I knew her well enough to recognize that tone. If there was one thing about Claire, it was that she never forgot an injustice. She never let things go quietly. And I swear, in that moment, I saw something shift in her eyes, not just anger, but resolve. A promise of retribution. The so-called officers paraded her down the street like it was some victory march, past neighbors who whispered behind their hands and shook their heads. Some looked sympathetic, others judgmental, but nobody stepped in to help. I followed close behind, my chest tight with fury, my mind spinning with what to do next. They shoved her into the back of a white SUV with tinted windows, not even a marked vehicle, just some beat-up ride with magnetic decals slapped on the doors that said, HOA enforcement. My wife, my partner, my heart, sat in there with her hands bound like she was a criminal, and something inside me hardened into stone. That was the day everything changed. That was the day I realized the HOA wasn't just a group of nosy neighbors enforcing lawn height rules and mailbox colors. No, this was something darker, something rotten at the core. They thought they could humiliate us, control us, break us into submission. They thought handcuffing my wife over a string of lights would scare us into falling in line. What they didn't realize was that they had just lit a fire we couldn't put out. Because in that moment, Claire and I both knew the same truth, we weren't going to let them win. Not this time. Not ever. When that SUV carrying my wife disappeared down the block, I stood in the middle of the street, fists shaking, chest heaving like I had just run a marathon. The neighborhood was buzzing with murmurs, but nobody had the guts to meet my eyes. They all went back inside their cookie-cutter houses, shutting blinds, locking doors, pretending they hadn't just witnessed 3 frauds drag a woman away in handcuffs for daring to hang lights. That silence, that cowardice, burned me almost as much as what those men had done. For a moment, I felt like I was standing alone in the ruins of something I used to trust, community. And that loneliness, that betrayal, carved into me deeper than I wanted to admit. But I didn't have the luxury of breaking down or wasting time. Claire was gone, and every second she spent in their grip was another second too long. I clenched my jaw, marched back up to the house, and went straight for my office. If they thought I was going to roll over, they didn't know who they were dealing with. I sat at my desk, staring at the clutter of paperwork, unpaid bills, and random junk I hadn't sorted in months. I cleared it all with one sweep of my arm and slammed my laptop down in the center. My fingers flew across the keys as I dug through every HOA document I had saved from meetings, every email, every pamphlet they'd ever slid under my door. I wanted to find a loophole, some clause I could weaponize. But what I found was worse, page after page of vague language, hidden fines, and contradictory codes that gave the board almost unlimited power to interpret rules at their discretion. That was legal cover for tyranny, and the fake cops knew it. Still, something didn't add up. Nowhere in those papers did it mention the ability to detain or enforce anything. They could fine, sure. They could threaten foreclosure, yes. But handcuffing? Kidnapping? That wasn't just shady, it was criminal. I picked up my phone and called the police, laying out everything I had seen, every detail of the uniforms, the SUV, the handcuffs. The officer on the other end listened politely, but when I mentioned the words HOA enforcement, his tone shifted. He sighed, said he'd make a note of it, and reminded me that HOAs were technically private organizations with their own contracts. I shouted back, private organizations don't get to impersonate cops and kidnap people, but all I got was bureaucratic calmness. Sir, unless you can prove they weren't authorized, our hands are tied. Maybe contact your HOA board directly. That was it. That was the response. They weren't coming. My wife could have been halfway to some basement by then, and the police didn't care. That was the moment I realized, this wasn't going to be solved by dialing 911. If I wanted Claire back, I had to do it myself. And if I wanted to stop this madness for good, I had to go deeper than just saving her. I had to burn the entire system that gave those thugs power. I grabbed my truck keys and bolted for the garage, heart hammering against my ribs. But before I turned the ignition, I paused, staring at the corner of the garage where 17 gleaming machines rested under tarps. Claire's pride and joy, her collection of Harleys. Each one was different, a story on two wheels. A 76 shovelhead she rebuilt from scrap, a fat boy she rode across 3 states, a softail she bought with the bonus from her first big job. That collection wasn't just metal and rubber, it was her legacy, her freedom, her fire. And the HOA hated it. They'd sent us letters for years, saying it disrupted the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood, threatening fines, demanding she sell them or store them off-site. Claire had fought tooth and nail, keeping every single one. I knew, deep down, that her bikes were part of why they had targeted her so viciously. I stood there, staring at those bikes, thinking. My mind raced with possibilities, my anger churning into something sharper, colder. Then it clicked. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I'd give them dirty. I'd make a statement so loud they'd choke on it. My fists clenched around the truck keys, but I didn't turn them. Instead, I walked back to the workbench, pulled open the bottom drawer, and stared at the gas canisters lined up in a row. Tools of construction could become tools of destruction in the right hands. The plan hit me like lightning, terrible, destructive, but righteous. If the HOA thought they could humiliate my wife by chaining her in front of neighbors, I'd humiliate them by torching the very thing they despised most. Her Harleys. 17 roaring machines of rebellion turned into a blaze visible for miles. It wasn't just destruction, it was symbolism. If they wanted conformity, I'd give them chaos. If they wanted obedience, I'd give them fire. But before I could set anything in motion, I had to know where they had taken her. So I started digging. I texted every neighbor I knew, asking if anyone saw where that SUV went. Most ignored me, some gave vague shrugs, but one older man, Mr. Patterson from across the street, finally called me. His voice shook as he whispered, "They went to the clubhouse. I saw them pull in. But, son, don't go there. They're not right. They've got cameras, locks, men on shifts." His warning only fueled my determination. If they thought the clubhouse could be their fortress, I'd turn it into their grave. I loaded the truck with what I needed: gasoline, rags, a crowbar, bolt cutters. My hands moved with a steady rhythm, almost detached, like I was preparing for a job I'd been training for all my life. Fear had no place in me anymore. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I was past caring about consequences. When I pulled into the empty lot near the clubhouse, night was falling. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the building loomed like a smug fortress, its windows glowing faintly. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, watching, waiting, planning. 2 men stood near the front door, arms crossed, radios clipped to their belts. Same fake uniforms, same cocky posture. My gut told me Claire was inside, maybe locked in some back room while they laughed about teaching her a lesson. The thought made my blood boil. I slipped out of the truck, moving low, hugging the edges of parked cars until I reached the back. The bolt cutters sliced clean through the chain on the side gate, the sound masked by crickets and distant traffic. I moved like a ghost, heart pounding but steps steady. Inside, I found a narrow hallway lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. Voices echoed faintly, men talking, laughing. I followed the sound until I reached a door. Pressing my ear against it, I heard her voice, Claire's voice, angry, unbroken, cursing them out. Relief washed over me, mixed with fury. She was alive. I didn't think. I kicked the door open, the wood splintering under my boot, and there she was, sitting on a chair, wrists cuffed, hair messy but eyes blazing with fire. 3 men spun around, shock painted across their faces. One of them shouted, "What the?" but I was already on him, swinging the crowbar into his gut. He crumpled with a howl. The second lunged, but I caught him with a backhand swing to the jaw, teeth clattering as he fell. The third reached for his pepper spray, but Claire, my fierce, unbreakable wife, threw her head forward and cracked him right on the nose. Blood sprayed as he stumbled back, howling. I rushed to her, yanking the keys from the fallen man's belt and unlocking the cuffs. The second those metal shackles fell from her wrists, she was on her feet, rubbing her raw skin but smiling through the pain. "Took you long enough," she whispered. I pulled her close, just for a heartbeat, then handed her the crowbar. "It's not over yet," I said. And she knew exactly what I meant. Together, we stormed out of that room, leaving the 3 groaning men behind. The hall was chaos now, shouts echoing as more of them rushed toward us. But I didn't care. We had fire in our veins, and we had a message to deliver. Back at the truck, I opened the garage bay and pulled the tarps from the Harleys. Claire froze, her eyes wide, understanding immediately. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from awe. I nodded. They wanted to destroy us for these bikes. Let's destroy them first. She didn't argue. Instead, she grabbed the gas can, unscrewed the lid, and started dousing chrome and leather with sharp, pungent liquid. When the first match struck and the flames roared to life, it was like unleashing a beast from a cage. 17 Harleys, her life's work, her passion, burned bright against the night, sending black smoke curling into the sky. The fire cracked and spat, metal popping, paint blistering. Neighbors poured out of their houses, gasping, some screaming, some filming. The HOA enforcers stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. Claire stood beside me, her face glowing in the firelight, tears streaming but her smile unwavering. "They'll never control us again," she said. And in that moment, I believed her. The flames rose higher, unstoppable, consuming everything in their path. And as the Harleys turned to ash, so did the fear that had gripped our lives. From the ashes, something new was born, not just revenge, but freedom. And this was only the beginning. The morning after the fire, the neighborhood felt different, like a town waking up after an earthquake, everything slightly off-kilter and rearranged. Ash dusted the hedges and sidewalks in a gray fine powder that clung to shoes and wound up in the narrow seams of our front door. The stench of burned rubber and hot metal lingered in the air for days, a stubborn perfume that would not let anyone forget what had happened. People walked slower, eyes on the ground or fixed on one another with a mix of fear and fascination. Some faces were openly hostile, mouths set in hard lines as if they wanted to scold us through the cracked vestibules of civility. Others carried a complicated sympathy, the sort that pretends to look away while its mind catalogues every detail for gossip later. Cameras had turned overnight into the new eyes of the neighborhood, and clips of the blaze, my wife and I silhouetted against that inferno, migrated across screens and phones as if the flames were a magnet, pulling in every idle viewer. Reporters showed up wearing solemn faces and pressed microphones, hungry for the right soundbite to tell a story about a community that had lost its way. The HOA issued a statement that read like a lawyer's novel, dense and careful, full of words meant to soothe and to shift blame. It called the incident regrettable and under investigation, managing to say a lot while actually saying nothing. Inside our house, in the room where Claire and I sat facing each other across a scarred coffee table, the world narrowed down to the two of us and the quiet aftershock that rocked through every joint of our lives. We did not sleep well that night. Sleep felt like surrender, and surrender had never been an option for either of us. Her hands still smelled faintly of smoke and oil, and when she reached for my wrist, her fingers were warm, anchoring me to the present in a way words never could. We did not speak at first. The space between us was thick with everything we had done and everything that could come crashing down because of it. The street outside our home had become a cordoned-off stage of rumor and accusation, and I could hear the distant, muffled exchanges of neighbors who had gathered beyond the caution tape to nominate themselves judge and jury. I watched her as she traced the edge of a photograph with her thumb, a picture from better days when the bikes lined our garage like proud veterans, chrome gleaming, leather seats shining in the sun. The memory of that line of steel and sound made her mouth tighten. The phone calls began shortly after dawn. Insurance adjusters, because there were policies to be read and clauses to be parsed, a lawyer we had contacted on a whim, who spoke with a practiced, measured cadence that made the raw edges of our panic dull just enough to be bearable, an old friend in another state who offered a flight and a couch and a chance to disappear for a while. The police came by twice, taking statements, scribbling notes, asking the same clinical questions in different ways, as if repetition might reveal a truth that one telling did not. Their faces were blank and professional, an emotionless mirror to the chaos the night before. The fire marshal took photographs and measured charred fragments, pointing out structural risks that could lead to collapse. Those assessments were practical and necessary, and in their way they reasserted the rule of law, the notion that there were processes and consequences that still held, even when else fell apart. The legal world moved differently from the world of burn and flame. It crept forward in deadlines and letters, in filings and hearings, and it closed around us like a net. A temporary restraining order was filed by the HOA against us, alleging reckless endangerment and property damage, while our lawyer counterfiled with claims of unlawful detainment and impersonation. The HOA had resources and a willingness to spend them. It had members whose retirement funds funded lawyers and whose social networks tightened like Gordian knots behind closed doors. They had an infrastructure of influence that did not need to shout to be heard. In turn, we learned to speak through filings, to let our grievances be measured by statutes and precedent. It felt strange to trade the rawness of the night for the sterile language of legal briefs, but we were forced to play by their rules now, because those rules were what could protect us from further harm. Public opinion, however, was a far messier currency. Social media feeds filled with takes and countertakes. Some people painted us as vigilantes who had burned their own history in a fit of spite. Others wrote long, indignant posts about the right to decorate one's home as one pleased, using our story as a parable about petty authoritarianism hidden behind camouflage and petty rules. Online commentators argued about symbolism and property rights, and the comment thread smelled of the same furious certainty that had driven those men to handcuff my wife in the first place. A few local bloggers sent breathless inquiries, flattering offers of interviews that promised to launch our story into the larger conversation about power, control, and the limits of private authority. We declined some of those, accepted others, and began to sift through the narrative we wanted to own. Claire, who had always been careful about the image she projected, surprised me by leaning into the telling, by allowing herself to be photographed, to sign statements, to look into cameras with a hard, bright stare that said enough was enough. The days that followed were heavy with the mundane chores of survival, cleaning up what could be saved, making calls, visiting city offices to file complaints, tracking down witnesses who might corroborate our version of the night. We discovered things about our neighborhood that we had not known, small fissures of resentment and policies born of convenience rather than principle. There were cost-cutting measures in the HOA budget, contracts with private security firms that had never been fully disclosed, and an undercurrent of people who wanted to maintain appearances at any cost. We learned that fear, when given a veneer of legitimacy, can become a governance system of its own. The more we looked, the more the threads connected into a tapestry of petty tyranny, and the more the outrage that had first lit our actions felt, in some sense, validated. But validation did not stave off consequences. The criminal investigation took its course, and for a time there was a pressure that felt like being under a descending press. Neighbors who had once greeted us briefly in the mailbox queue began to cross the street when they saw us, eyes wide and determinedly blank. Some left flowers at the edge of our driveway, anonymous tokens that read like small apologies. Others left notes full of slender accusations, thinly veiled pleas to conform. The HOA circulated petitions calling for stronger enforcement of community standards, their language careful to avoid any mention of the men in the uniforms. We received threatening letters, warnings couched in legalese, suggesting that if we did not cease our campaign of disorder, the association would pursue full restitution. Claire called the letters the polite violence of bureaucracy, a phrase I repeated to anyone who would listen. There were nights when we considered leaving, packing nothing but the essentials and driving until the neighborhood became a memory. The temptation to run had a siren song quality, whispering that the only escape from the ugly knot was to vanish. Yet the idea of leaving felt like conceding that property and place could be stolen from us by a band of people in bad uniforms. We refused to become refugees from our own lives. Instead, we doubled down on community building that was not dependent on boards or bylaws. We invited neighbors who had hesitated before to small dinners, served food out on folding tables, and invited conversations that began awkwardly but sometimes ended in a shared laugh. It was not easy. It was slow. But change rarely arrives in a single blaze, it tends to creep, to gather, to outlast. At the same time, we had to reckon with what we had done and what it meant. Burning the bikes had been a forfeiture and a triumph all at once. The bikes were more than machines, they were memories, promises, cold evenings warmed by the rumble of an engine, and long road trips that stitched our life into a ribbon of asphalt. Watching them go had felt like amputating a part of ourselves. There were moments after the fire when Claire cried as if some part of her had been excised forever. She mourned with the same ferocity she had loved, and I learned that destruction and grief move hand in hand. We spoke about responsibility in quiet rooms, about the line between protest and harm, and about the legacy we wanted to leave for one another. We told ourselves that our action had sent a necessary message, but we did not pretend it had been cost-free. It had been a reckoning and a wound and a catalyst for both. Lawyers did their work with the kind of detachment that felt like a salve. They negotiated a fragile truce with the HOA that prevented immediate eviction and complicated the possibility of further punitive measures. At the same time, the county prosecutor announced an inquiry into the men who had impersonated enforcement officers, and the first arrests were made. Watching the news reports of those arrests, the way the supposed authority figures were led away in handcuffs, felt like watching a mirror being put back together. It did not undo the night, nor did it restore metal and chrome to our garage, but it offered a measure of justice that the system sometimes, rarely, grudgingly provides. The men who had once strutted across our lawn with badges sewn into fake uniforms now faced real badges and real charges, and in those moments the universe felt a smidge more balanced. Outside the narrower orbit of our household, the incident sparked a broader conversation in town halls and community centers. People who had never thought seriously about the reach of private organizations began to question the balance of power between residents and associations. Debates were held about transparency, about the contracts that allowed private firms to play at enforcing law, and about the necessity of clearer statutes to prevent similar abuses. In public forums, voices rose and fell, sometimes spirited and sometimes shrill, but always with the undertow of a community trying to define itself anew. Claire and I spoke at one of those meetings, our words going out into a room that hummed with conflicting emotions. We did not speak about how we had set fire to 17 bikes beyond the admission that we had acted, and that we had accepted the consequences. Instead, we spoke about dignity and the right to live without fear of humiliation at the hands of people who mistook petty authority for moral clarity. Months passed. The scar on the garage where the bikes had once stood slowly weathered. New plants were put in to hide the blackened concrete, and sometimes the sight of green shoots made me feel hopeful in a small, steady way. The HOA was restructured, its board replaced by members who had been elected on platforms of transparency and restraint. New rules were drafted to prevent private enforcement from taking the shape of impersonation, and disclosures became required where they had been optional before. Progress, in the end, was incremental and messy, but it was real. Claire and I rebuilt more than our home. We rebuilt our sense of agency, which had been brittle and easily bent before that night. We learned the value of stubbornness and the cost of action. We learned that resistance could take many forms, some destructive and shocking, others patient and deliberate, and that every choice leaves a wake. We learned, too, that the thing we most wanted to preserve, our freedom to live and to celebrate our lives, was worth fighting for, but also worth protecting in ways that did not always require flame. In the quiet, after the cameras left and the papers faded from the newsstands, we planted a small garden where the bikes had sat, a patchwork of wildflowers that refused to be uniform. It became a place where neighbors would sometimes bring bread and coffee, where conversations could begin and not end in edicts. From the ashes, something fragile and stubborn grew, and for the first time since that early morning, I allowed myself to believe that we had not just survived but had changed something important about the place we had chosen to call home. The real storm didn't hit until later, long after the smoke had cleared and the cameras had packed up their cords. At first, I thought we had weathered the worst of it, the fake cops arrested, the HOA board shaken and partially replaced, neighbors whispering but quieter now, as if they were realizing how close they'd all come to letting tyranny masquerade as law. But that kind of calm was just the eye of the hurricane. What came after was harder. It wasn't fists, or cuffs, or flames. It was the slow grind of bureaucracy, the sharp edges of whispers, and the invisible hand of retaliation. Because people who build their lives on control don't stop when their first weapon is taken from them, they adapt, they find new ways to squeeze. It started with letters. Neat, crisp, folded into envelopes that looked so ordinary, almost polite. But inside was venom written in legal jargon, notice of violation, demand for immediate action, assessment for damages. Each one claimed something new, that we owed fines for fire damage to common property, that we had endangered the neighborhood stability, that we were in breach of a clause we'd never heard of. I read them out loud at the kitchen table, my voice tight, and Claire would roll her eyes, slam her fist down, and say, "Let them try. We'll fight every damn one." And we did. Our lawyer became almost family during that season, his tired voice on the phone a kind of rope that kept us tethered to sanity. But legal battles don't end in clean victories, they drip money from your pockets and hours from your life until even winning feels like bleeding. The neighbors weren't neutral anymore either. The fire had forced everyone to pick a side, and the split ran deep. Some came to us quietly, whispering support, sliding dishes of food onto our porch with notes that said, "We're with you, even if we can't say it out loud." Others looked at us like we were a contagion that had swept through their perfect little subdivision. The whispers turned into actions. Cars parked across our driveway, by accident, trash cans tipped over, our mailbox stuffed with flyers about community responsibility. One morning we found tire tracks carved into our lawn, deep ruts that ruined Claire's flower bed. She stood there in the early light, hands on her hips, her jaw trembling with rage, and I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She went back inside, grabbed a spade, and started replanting. That was Claire. Every attack only pushed her to stand taller, dig deeper, refuse harder. Still, the hardest weight wasn't outside. It was in the quiet of our home, the silence that sometimes stretched too long. Nights when the house creaked and I couldn't sleep, I'd hear Claire moving around, restless, pacing from room to room. Sometimes I found her in the garage, staring at the blackened spot where the Harleys had once lined up like an army. Her shoulders would slump then, her fire dim for just a flicker, and I'd feel the guilt crawl through me like ivy. It had been my idea to burn them. She'd agreed, yes, she'd even struck the match. But I was the one who had spoken the words first, and the weight of that choice pressed on me. I'd sit beside her, take her hand, and we'd sit in silence, the ghosts of chrome and steel heavy in the air. But grief has a strange way of turning into purpose. One night, sitting in that garage, Claire turned to me and said, if they wanted to erase who we are, they failed. Those bikes were never the point. We were. And in that moment, I understood. The Harleys had been a symbol, yes, but not the source of her strength. We were the source. And as long as we stood together, we could outlast anything they threw at us. So we began to rebuild, not just physically, but spiritually. We started attending city council meetings, speaking up whenever private security contracts came up for vote. Claire became a voice people listened to, not because she was loud, but because she was fearless. Her story carried weight, and when she stood in a room and said, "This happened to me. It can happen to you," people leaned forward. We started organizing small gatherings of homeowners across the city, people tired of HOA overreach, tired of living in fear of fines and fake cops. What began as a handful of angry neighbors drinking coffee in our living room grew into a movement with petitions, rallies, and coverage on the evening news. The HOA board, stripped of their enforcers, scrambled to paint us as radicals, but the more they attacked, the more people came to our side. And yet, the fight wasn't just public, it was personal. I learned quickly that revenge isn't a single act, a blaze of glory you walk away from. It's a long road paved with persistence. Every time they tried to bury us in paperwork, we answered twice as strong. Every time someone slashed at us with rumors, we showed up in the light, refusing to hide. Every time they tried to isolate us, we built bridges with others. It was exhausting, bone-deep exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time, I felt like we weren't just reacting, we were shaping the story. There was a night, months later, when Claire and I drove out of the neighborhood, away from the gossip and the lawsuits, and parked on a ridge outside town. We sat on the hood of the truck, the stars spread wide above us, the cool air filling our lungs. Claire leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Do you ever regret it? The fire?" I thought about it for a long time. The flames had taken so much, her bikes, our peace, the thin thread of belonging we'd once had. But they had also lit something we might never have found otherwise, clarity, strength, defiance. "No," I finally said. "Because it woke us up. And once you're awake, you can't go back to sleep." She smiled then, a small, tired smile, and I knew she felt it too. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But we weren't afraid anymore. And that was everything. The end of the story didn't come with a single explosion or courtroom verdict. It came slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night, a little light at a time. And maybe that was fitting, because what we had been fighting wasn't just one crooked HOA board or a few men playing dress-up as cops. What we'd really been battling was the kind of darkness that creeps into communities when people stop paying attention, when power hides in plain sight and everyone looks the other way. That darkness doesn't vanish with fire or handcuffs. It fades when people stand up, when they refuse to be quiet, when they shine light where others want shadows. The HOA fought us tooth and nail until the very end. They filed motions, appealed rulings, and tried to drown us in technicalities. They even brought in a new law firm, one of those high-rise outfits with polished floors and glass-walled conference rooms. But by then, the tide had shifted. Every hearing became a spectacle, with neighbors packing the benches, local reporters scribbling notes, and Claire sitting in the front row like a general in the middle of a campaign. She never wavered. Even when the lawyers tried to twist the narrative, painting us as reckless, dangerous, even unfit to live in the subdivision, she stared them down with a steady gaze that made their words sound hollow. The turning point came when the state attorney general opened an investigation. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had grown into something larger, a question of whether private organizations had gone too far, whether they were operating as unregulated governments. Suddenly, it wasn't just about our street or our burned garage. It was about every homeowner in the state who had ever been fined for a paint color, or threatened for a garden, or bullied into silence. We got letters from strangers across the country, people who said, "Your story is mine too. Don't give up." And we didn't. When the verdict finally came, it was less dramatic than you'd imagine. No gavel slam, no shouting. Just a judge reading from a piece of paper, his voice steady, almost tired, the fake cops guilty of impersonating officers, the HOA board members complicit in fraud and intimidation, the bylaws they had twisted declared unenforceable. It was all written down in the dry language of law, but sitting there, listening, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for months. Claire reached for my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not victory, peace. Afterward, life didn't snap back to normal. It never does after something like that. Our garage remained an empty shell for months, a quiet reminder of what had been lost. Sometimes I caught Claire standing in the doorway, staring at the spot where her Harleys used to gleam under the light. But there was no bitterness in her expression anymore. Instead, there was resolve. One evening, she said, "I think it's time to rebuild. Not the same bikes, something new." And so we did. We turned that garage into a workshop, not for machines but for people. Claire started teaching kids in the neighborhood how to fix engines, how to handle tools, how to build something with their own hands. The sound of laughter and clattering metal filled the space, and slowly, the smell of smoke was replaced by the scent of oil and sawdust. Our neighbors changed too. Some who had once crossed the street to avoid us now came by to talk, to ask questions, to apologize. A few never forgave us, never dropped the suspicion in their eyes, but that no longer mattered. We had stopped living for their approval. We had our own circle now, people who believed in standing up, who knew that silence is the soil where abuse grows. We started a nonprofit, small at first, dedicated to helping homeowners push back against abusive HOAs. It grew faster than we ever expected. Claire became its face, her story the spark that lit fires in communities far beyond our own. But the greatest change wasn't outside, it was inside us. Before all this, we had lived quietly, content to mind our own business. We thought that was safety. But we learned the hard way that safety bought with silence isn't real, it's an illusion that cracks the moment someone decides to test it. Now, we knew better. We weren't just survivors of a fight, we were guardians of a truth, that freedom in a community only exists when people are willing to defend it. There's a night I still think about, long after the trials and headlines faded. We had driven out past the city again, up into the hills where the stars burn brighter. We sat on the tailgate of the truck, the cool air wrapping around us, and Claire leaned against me, her hair brushing my shoulder. We didn't talk about Harleys or lawsuits or HOAs. We just sat, breathing, alive. And after a long silence, she said, "You know, they thought they broke us. But they only reminded us of who we are." I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "They'll never take that from us." The story didn't end with fire. It didn't end in courtrooms or protests or speeches. It ended here, in the quiet strength of knowing we had faced the worst and come out unbowed. And maybe that's the only real victory anyone ever gets in this life, not winning, not conquering, but refusing to be broken. And so, that's where I leave it. A man and his wife, scarred but unshaken, living in a house that once stood in the shadow of fear but now stands in the light of freedom. The Harleys may be ashes, but the spirit that rode them roars louder than ever, carried not by engines, but by us. And if the world should ever forget that lesson, well, there's always another match.